Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This is often listed as a must-read science fiction book, which I agree with. It's often listed as the #1 spot on many people's top 10 list. It's often listed as people's favorite science fiction book of all time, which puts me in a tiny bit of an awkward spot right now, because I really, really liked Hyperion, but I also have a huge problem with it. Pause for 1 second. Look, the cover's fantastic, but why does this guy have 2 arms? He's supposed to have 4, right? Am I crazy? Sorry, go on. Hyperion is set in the far distant future. Humanity has spread amongst the stars and is now on the eve of what could be a cataclysmic galactic war. 7 pilgrims, specifically selected from among millions of applicants, are sent on a pilgrimage to the world of Hyperion, a world full of mysteries, world full of questions, a world directly in path of this oncoming war, and a world that is home to the enigmatic time tombs, structures that appear to be moving backwards in time, structures that radiate a strange entropic field that negatively affects anything it comes in contact with. The pilgrims are on their way to seek an audience and perhaps seek boons from, or seek assistance from, or answers from the creature or entity known as the Shrike. The Shrike, once known to stay closer to the time tombs, has begun ranging further and further south on the planet of Hyperion. More and more people are disappearing in violent acts. The Shrike is taking more and more victims as time goes on. On the way to the time tombs, the pilgrims talk amongst themselves to try and figure out why they were selected, what makes their group special, knowing that the likelihood of returning from a Shrike pilgrimage is very, very low. So they decide to tell each other their stories. They decide to tell each other who they are and why they're here and why they think they were selected. And through this, they hope to find out if there are any clues that might help them survive this journey or might help them understand more about the time tombs and the Shrike. And this is the core of the book. This is what the book is about. It is essentially 6 short stories connected by a overarching narrative that ties them all together. And I think this is brilliantly done. I love short stories, just right off the bat. And of all the short story collections I've read, especially those that do try this overarching narrative that ties them together, this is absolutely the best example of it. The stories themselves are absolutely fantastic. I'll go through each of them and my thoughts on them in a little minute. I just really want to talk about the connecting narrative and how well it really flows into each of the stories. The stories don't feel jammed into the book out of necessity. The stories don't feel written separately. They feel as part of this narrative, which is how they were written and how they're intended to be read. And the way they just build upon each other and slowly reveal more about what's going on while making you question other things is just masterfully done. Speaking of the stories, I'll just want to kind of review each of them as we go. The priest story, the opening story of the book, is really, really good. It serves as a pretty good introduction to the story. We focus less on the time tombs and the Shrike and the mystery that's at the core, and instead focus on a priest character who has lost his faith and is now on a self-imposed exile to the planet of Hyperion, where as an anthropologist, he wants to go study this long-lost tribe that exists there. And it serves as a really good introduction to Hyperion itself as a planet. We experience several of the cities on the planet and the sort of environment of the planet, and we find out about the fascinating Tesla trees, these gigantic trees which take electricity in among themselves and then release it in devastating fires and devastating electrical discharges that give birth to a place known as the Fire Forest, which is only crossable at certain times of the year. And it's through this Fire Forest the priest goes to go find this uncontacted people who he believes were the survivors of a crashed ship many, many years ago. And we end up with what is really quite an interesting, like, anthropological and religion sort of story. We explore the mystery surrounding these lost peoples, the mystery surrounding their habits and their actions and their entire worldview. And we do it through a character that is struggling with faith, struggling with his identity, and just struggling with who he is as a person and what he's doing here. And the ending is so vivid in detail and so shocking and well done that it's going to stick in my head for many years. Next up is probably my least favorite story in the book. It's still very good. It's just not quite up to the caliber of some of the other stories. And that would be the soldier's story. This follows Colonel Cassard, known for his infamy around the entire hegemony of man, which is the galactic government. He was known for winning a battle on a planet, but doing so in a violent guerrilla warfare sort of style that left the planet devastated. It was the only way to win the planet. It was the only way to beat the ℚ𝕚𝕠𝕠𝕜, who are this force of humans that split off from the hegemony a long time ago and now live on spaceships and in big space stations and occasionally come into the hegemony space to raid. So while he was successful at denying the ℚ𝕚𝕠𝕠𝕜 the planet, the devastation and the violence and the death toll caused led him to be a scapegoat of. But the story he tells takes place much before that. He starts off talking about his training, and in training he's in these simulations of historic battles. And in these simulations he meets a woman with whom he starts a sexual relationship, and he only ever seems to see her in this simulation, and he seeks her out in the real world but can never find her. Until many years later, he has long ago graduated, he has served in the military for many years, and he is on the way back from this devastating victory. He's on a hospital ship on the way back from injuries he sustained. And this hospital ship comes under attack from ℚ𝕚𝕠𝕠 forces. And this is really the bulk of the story. What we talk about here is his attempts to survive and his attempts to defeat the ℚ𝕚𝕠𝕠 forces that are attacking this hospital ship. And then we learn more about this woman that he met in his simulations. We learn that there's more going on there, that she might be more or less real than we really thought. And there are some clear connections between this and the planet Hyperion and the Shrike that we start to explore there. And as I said, it's my least favorite story, but it's mostly just a matter of how good the other stories are, and this one just kind of came off as a bit more generic sci-fi with some strangely sexual sections, which just felt a little bit out of place for me. But overall, the story's still very good. Up next is The Poet's Tale. The poet is a character that I found super annoying at the start of this book. He's arrogant, he interrupts people, he's a drunkard, and I hated reading about the poet. Until The Poet's Tale, after which I loved the poet because his story was just so well written. It's more narrow in scope than some of the others. It's really the story about his growth of his career, him trying to write poetry and trying to get poetry published, and then ending up publishing a series of pulp novels and discovering one day that his muse is gone. He can't write poetry anymore. And then he travels for a while until he finally ends up on the planet of Hyperion. And while he's there, there are a number of deaths. And suddenly he can start writing poetry again. And it is a story about his muse, about his magnum opus, his life's work, and about trying to complete it. And it is really, really well written, and it is emotional, and it is really, really well done, and I really liked it. But it doesn't come close to the next book, which, as far as I know, everyone kind of agrees is the absolute best part of this entire book, which is The Scholar's Tale. This is a story about fatherhood, about family. This is a story about a father and his daughter. His daughter is an archaeologist studying the time tombs on Hyperion when they befall an accident and come down with a sickness. And it is a story about the father and the mother trying to find a cure for this sickness and trying to find what happened to their daughter and trying to figure out how they can live life with their daughter now. And it is a story about sacrifice and family, and it is heartbreaking and just wonderfully written, and is entirely worth reading this entire book just to read this story. It is so good. And then the detective story, the penultimate story, is again one I quite liked, one that I seem to see people saying they don't enjoy online, but I thought was really good. It's essentially a noir cyberpunk private detective story. The detective takes on a case, and the client is an artificial intelligence who is from the group of artificial intelligences that broke off from humanity hundreds of years ago. And during the story, we follow the case, but I think the most important part of this story, and why I think it might be one of the most important in the book, is we really start to see the bigger picture during the detective story. During the detective story, it might not be spelled out as much, but we start to see the different factions that are really working at play here, the different factions that are maneuvering pieces around this game board that is Hyperion, and the different ambitions and hopes of these factions. And I think we really start to see the bigger picture of why everything is happening and what's going on in this story. And for that, I think it's one of the better ones in the book. And finally is the console story, who is probably my second favorite story of the book. It is told in just a really fascinating way, jumping not only between different characters, but back and forth in time, in a way that might come off as confusing, but I found to be really, really well done. The core story that we start with is basically a love story between a man who is on a spaceship and a woman who lives on a colony planet. This colony planet is going to be brought into the hegemony of man, but to do so it needs a caster, a portal essentially built on the planet that allows instantaneous travel between this planet and other locations within the hegemony of man. Right now, the only way there is on these giant spin ships, these faster-than-light transports, where the crew are in suspended animation for the entire trip. So the trip itself takes many years to go from the colony planet to the hegemony of man and back to grab supplies and resources and personnel. But the people on board only experience it in about a week or so as they basically sleep the entire trip. And this is a love story between a man on that ship and a woman on the colony as they experience a very unique relationship where they may only spend a short amount of time together. As far as the man is concerned, it's only weeks apart. But for the woman, years pass. The man will show up, meet her as a young girl, return, meet her as a young woman, and then the next time he comes back, she'll be middle-aged. For him, this has all happened just like that, and the way this affects their relationship is pretty core to the story. And the whole love story is done really, really well. I really enjoyed it. But I think the main interest from me in this story is that it really is also a story about colonization, about the effects colonization and industry have on not only the peoples of the colony, but the environment and the animals and plants and everything around them in the colony. It's a story of how a place changes and about how the decisions made by a few people can affect a lot of people and can affect the histories of entire worlds. I really love the introspective sort of nature of this one. It's a lot more thoughtful. It's a lot more thought-provoking, I think, than a lot of the other stories in the book. And I think it goes a long way to explaining what's going on and leading us to kind of some answers about some of the mysteries that are going on. And it leads well into my next point, which is the world building in this book is fantastic. Normally, I feel like the world building of a book takes place, in the first quarter or so, and then we kind of jump into the narrative. But here, we find out very little about the world at the start, but more and more of it is revealed as we go through the stories. The stories reveal new places, reveal new people, reveal new political systems and groups that we didn't know about before. And they're not fully explained because these are people talking to other people that live in this universe. And so the way we are drip-fed this information really feels invigorating and exciting. When I turn a new page and someone mentions a new group and what they're doing, and it just kind of clicks in place about how that makes sense with the other things we've been told is just fantastic. And is a feeling I just adore. And so it was just so well done here. So I really like the stories. I love the world building. The characters I quite like. The prose I think is fantastic. The pacing, awesome. What is my issue with Hyperion? My main complaint, and this might be unfair, is the book just doesn't have an ending. Sure, there are words on the last page of this book, but it just sort of stops. We don't get any conclusions, we don't get any climaxes, we don't get any reveals or answers. And I've been told that this is a book that is more about the journey than about the destination, and I get that. But I feel like the journey of this book was trying to figure out these answers. The entire purpose of telling these stories was to try and, reveal more about the Time Tombs, the Shrike, why they've been picked, what they're going to do when they get there, how they're going to survive. So the entire journey was about building to this climax, this conclusion, and it just isn't there. And it just means that when I closed the book, despite loving basically every second of reading it, the overwhelming feeling at the end was one of disappointment, one of kind of shock, and just disappointment, just left a real sour taste in my mouth. Now, I've heard that this may not be Dan Simmons' fault. This might have been the fault of the publisher. Supposedly, according to some things I've read, Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion were meant to be written as one book, but the publisher cut them in half. I don't know how true that is. For one point, I heard that Fall of Hyperion is told in more sort of traditional and novel style, whereas this is told in short stories. So it would be kind of weird to write half your book as this stitch up of short stories and then the other half of the book as a novel. So I'm not too sure I buy that, but maybe that's true. Either way, that doesn't get rid of the rug pull I feel at the end of this book. Because this book is so well reviewed and so well loved by so many people, I just feel it weird that I hadn't been warned at some point that to really get an ending to this book, you need to read book 2. Which normally is fine. I kind of hate when books don't have a conclusion, don't have an ending, and need another book to explain themselves, but it's fine. But I just feel that a book this well loved and this big should have been able to stand up on its own, and it mostly does, and I'm sure for lots of people that the ending is not a problem. But for me, I loved trying to work out the puzzle, trying to work out what was going on. And for this book to just leave with none of that done, really, is just really bad for my experience. On top of that, We have 7 pilgrims and only 6 stories, and it is the 7th and missing story that I was the most excited about when we got started. The Templars story, I was so interested in and I was so excited for. I feel like the Templar is the most enigmatic, most mysterious character, the one that is the most interesting to me and the one I wanted to learn the most about, and it's just not in this book, and that disappointed me as well, but that's fine. So look, I have ordered book 2. It's on the way. Hopefully it'll arrive soon. When it does, I'll read it, and I might, in a video for that one, even come back and change my thoughts on Hyperion. Having a good ending will make my issues with this book less severe, I'm sure. But for now, I loved most of this book, but the ending really hit me badly. It reminds me of a YouTube video I watched by the British comedian, panel show host and guest David Mitchell. He has a short series of videos from, must be like a decade ago now, called David Mitchell's Soapbox, where he just sort of complains about things. In one of his videos, he complains about the idea of living in the moment, and he uses an example where when watching a sports game, you know, it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. He desperately wants one of the teams to win, and if his team wins, he can then look back on that entire game and say, yes, great, I loved that game, I was enjoying myself the whole time. But if his team loses, when looking back, he's just remembering how tense it was only to have a defeat at the end, and oh, terrible, I hated watching that, it was awful. And I kind of, to a much lesser extent, feel that in this book. I know I loved reading this book during the time, but the sour taste in my mouth and the disappointment I felt at the end left me in a really bad state and left me feeling really rough about the rest of the book. Overall, though, I do think this is a very good book. It's getting an 8 out of 10 for me, and this is an 8 out of 10 with an asterisk that I'll come back after Fall of Hyperion and perhaps give it a higher rating, perhaps give it a lower rating, I don't know. But I do just now have to wait for book 2 because it feels like it's needed reading after book 1 because it just didn't have an ending. This video though does have an ending, and that ending is talking about bingo. If you don't know at this point, somehow this is my bingo board. I got it from Reddit's fantasy subreddit, and this is a list of 25 writing prompts, and the idea is to read books that match all of them. Hyperion hit the prologue and epilogue square, which needs a book to have a prologue and an epilogue, and despite not having an ending, this book does have a chapter titled Epilogue. So I'm locking it in. That is the second last book I need, and there is only 1 spot remaining, and I will give no prizes for guessing which of these coming soon books goes in that spot. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to pick up a copy of Hyperion for yourself, and I do think you should if you haven't read it, it is definitely worth a read. I do have a link in the description below. Otherwise, just please like, comment, subscribe, do the algorithm things, but mostly just remember to keep reading. Thanks so much.